Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the UBS Center for Economics in Society, I would like to welcome you to today's lecture. A warm welcome also to those who are joining us at home via live stream. I also particularly welcome our guests this evening, Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee. Some of you may recall that they were here once before at a similar event about 5 years ago, when they honored us with a lecture on poor economics, a radical rethinking of the way to fight global poverty. And the ambiguity in this title, Poor Economics, already tells us a little bit about how they think about modern economics and what we can do with it. My name is Ernst Fehr. I'm a professor of economics here at the University of Zurich, and I'm the director of the UBS Center of Economics in Society. This center is an associated institute at the Department of Economics. This year, we celebrate, by the way, the center's 10th anniversary. It was founded in 2012 due to a generous donation of UBS to the University of Zurich. We are looking back with some pride at the achievements of the past decade. The UBS donation enabled us to establish in total 8 long-term professorships, the UBS Foundation professorships. The donation also gave us the chance to support doctoral students by awarding roughly 90 annual scholarships to students from all over the world to enter the Zurich Graduate School of Economics. This generous support, along with other generous donations, have made it possible to attract world-class professors from very good institutions all over the globe, for example, Harvard, Stanford, or Chicago. In addition, the scholarship program enabled us to attract very talented international and national students, and as a consequence, the Department of Economics at this university is today among the very best European departments. The center also has organized numerous public events on important topics with leading experts to promote knowledge transfer and to foster a continuous dialogue. Many events featured very prominent speakers, like, for example, today's speakers are. Before I introduce our guests today, let me say a few things about the field of economics, because the general public has still a rather narrow view about what economists do and what economics is about. This is kind of a pet story on my side, because people really misunderstand what we economists do, still up to the present day. And that's no coincidence, because in the 1970s and 1980s, when I studied economics, the discipline was mainly interested in macroeconomic questions, such as unemployment, inflation, exchange rates, taxation, etc. These are undoubtedly important questions. However, today, the scope of economics, the breadth of questions we ask, and the depth with which we can answer them is radically improved. Today, we ask questions such as, how can we improve schooling and the education system? What are effective incentives for teachers? How can we improve the healthcare system? And how can we help people to lead healthier lives or to save more for retirement? How can we improve child and youth development? To what extent, and if so, how does women empowerment in developing countries enhance the overall prosperity of these countries and the situation of women in these countries? Or how can we reduce political polarization? A very important question today. And which role does culture play in all these problems? This just gives you example questions about the breadth of questions we are asking today. And I think it's fair to say that economics has become a general behavioral science that takes insights from other disciplines, such as psychology, anthropology, neuroscience, or sociology seriously and tries to extend them. Our guests today, Abhijit and Esther, have greatly contributed to this broadening and deepening of economics. Esther is Abdul Latif Jamil Professor of Poverty Alleviation and Development Economics at MIT, and jointly with Abhijit, a co-founder and co-director of the Abdul Latif Jamil Poverty Action Lab The short synonym for this, or acronym for this, is JPAL, and every economist on the globe now knows what JPAL is. And now you know it too. Abhijit is the Ford Foundation International Professor of Economics at MIT, and as I said before, he co-founded that center. And by the way, the existence of that center is due to a private donation given to MIT, and that just shows how important private donations are for our universities, because it really helped transform development economics to a degree that was never envisaged 3 decades ago. In 2019, Esther and Abhijit, together with Michael Kramer from Harvard, were honored with the Nobel Prize in Economics for their experimental approach to fight global poverty. Now, what is the distinguishing feature of their work? What are their accomplishments? Well, I can't enumerate all of them, but I tried to kind of extract what are the most important in my view. Well, they have radically reshaped development economics with the type of questions they asked and with the methods they used to answer them. And in doing this, they have, as a byproduct, also contributed to a radical reshaping of modern economics. From a thoroughly theoretical discipline, when I studied economics, my teaching was like math teaching, definition, theorem, proof. And that's very different today. I mean, we still are an analytical science, but we are an empirical science these days. And we try to answer practical questions with credible scientific methods. And that's exactly what Abhijit and Esther have achieved. They helped transform our discipline from a theoretical discipline to a discipline that is guided by the desire to solve practical policy problems with credible scientific methods. In terms of methodological innovations, they have made pioneering contributions to field experimentation in economics. And in these experiments, individuals or groups are randomly assigned to treatment and control conditions, which enables much more rigorous insights compared to non-experimental approaches. And if you hear the abbreviation RCT today, randomized controlled trial, so you shouldn't be shy away from that term. It's just a short name for the experimental approach. A randomized controlled trial is just assigning people randomly to treatment and control condition. Many of us in Zurich have been inspired by this approach, and therefore our department is also one of the hotspots of field experimentation in Europe today. In this context, it is also worthwhile to mention 2 research centers at our department that are dedicated to the conduct of such experiments, not exclusively, but to a large degree, in various economic domains. One of the centers is the Center for Child Wellbeing and Development, and the other center is the Zurich Center for Economic Development. Prioritizing research in this area is part of our mission to tackle what we call the 5 global challenges the world is facing today, one of them being reducing poverty and inequality. Now, before we start, I want to give you some technical information. During the presentation, you can already submit your questions online. So take your mobile phone or open a new tab in your browser and go to menti.com if you want to ask questions. And dial in with the code 7750-5868. I repeat, menti.com on your iPhone, and dial in with the code 775-5868. I will then try to see what questions comes in and select the most popular or the most important questions at the very beginning. So now, Abhijit and Esther, the floor is yours, and we are looking forward to an exciting presentation. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Ernst, for that very generous introduction. And thank you for the UBS Center for hosting us, as you said, a second time on a second book. So this we are the last time it was poor economics, this time it's good economics. We've improved as a profession. Good economics for hard times. And it's, that's what the title we had. This was written in 2019. I wouldn't say the world has improved since then. Maybe you disagree. So it's harder times. Now, I think this is indisputable. The most important issues that if you open the newspaper, there's just enormous amount of talk about, for example, if you come from the US, about inflation, and everywhere about the war and its consequences for prices in Europe, and should gasoline prices be regulated? Should gas be imported from Russia? What about trade? The world was, I think, peaked in terms of its acceptance of globalization in the late 2000s, and since then there's been backtracking, and the backtracking is that a good thing or a bad thing? Immigration, always a favorite of many political discourses. Yesterday, the RN in France did much better than it should have, or I hoped had, and it was on the strength of, obviously, talking about immigration. A lot of those things are connected to inequality and its various readings of it, and that, of course, feeds into social policy. What do you do about inequality, and climate change being another enormous sort of cloud that's covering the world. The pandemic remains one of our concerns, and what to do about it. We've sort of little bit getting closer to throwing up our hands and kind of pretending it doesn't exist, but I don't know whether that's the appropriate response. And then, discrimination and racism, that was an issue that in some ways got highlighted during the pandemic, during the Black Lives Matter movement, at least in the US, but it's a perpetual issue, not unconnected to immigration, for example. The first thing to note about this is every one of these things is an economic issue. So that's maybe, there might also be sometimes a sociological issue or a psychological issue, but they're fundamentally about economics. And and this is why I said this, the one set of people whose opinions are not counted on these issues are economists. This graphic is from the UK, but in fact, we collected similar data in the US, and you get similar results. And the core fact you take away is, what's the question? The question is, who are the people you trust whose opinions you trust on a particular issue of their expertise? So nurses, not on poetry, nurses on nursing, doctors on medicine, historians on history. And this stunning fact is that economists are really rock bottom, only beaten by local politicians and global politicians. That's actually connects to the next thing I'm going to say, which is sort of connects this to a larger concern we have. But I think that this fact is sort of in combination with what I just said, which is that we're dealing with all these economic issues. There are decisions that are being made all the time about what the right responses are, and we suffer from what one could politely call a massive credibility gap. Whoever is speaking about this, they're not listening to us. And now, why? Why don't they listen to us? What's wrong with us? I feel like, I don't feel particularly less competent than my friends who are historians, but, maybe I'm flattering myself. But I think part of it is that we deal with narratives that are potentially complicated to explain, which everybody cares about. The one advantage historians have is that most people don't know what they say. And therefore, they have a huge advantage, because it isn't the case that you can dispute what they say, since you don't actually know. We actually talk about all the issues people care about in their daily lives. And then, of course, they have opinions on these things. And often those opinions turn out to be what they disagree with them. Now, all of that would be okay if it were the case that, yes, they disagree with us, but then, we present our case and they get moved. Now, this graphic is one where is a measure of that disagreement. It's a question that, about, this was still a while ago. Under Trump, there was these tariffs on aluminum and steel, and the question that was asked of a panel of experts, which happens to include me as well, who are supposed to be like, prominent economists, was, how many of you support these tariffs? Do you think that they would increase well-being? And 0% of the economists. There was some disagreement at the margin about whether this is obviously wrong or really obviously wrong, but not much more than that. So it was always, and then the 33%, and actually that number to me surprised me. I thought actually 33% is a low number, because in some ways, and let me try to suggest why this is maybe not surprising. The reason why we believe that trade is good mostly comes from thinking about all the things that trade does. Okay, so you import aluminum, therefore you don't spend resources on that. The resources move to something else, and something else that's good that happens. So that's a complicated thought at the best of times. And whereas, in some sense, when you invite somebody to think about the benefits of trade, they're supposed to most of the benefits of trade are actually relatively minimal. Meaning, how many dollars did I gain from the removal of tariffs on aluminum? I don't know, 10. I don't know, 20. But so for most people, these things are small, intangible quantities that don't actually explicitly show up in their lives. But they know somebody who lost their job because in their hometown, an industry shut down. So the aggregation so they know the losses are concentrated, the losses are visible, the gains are diffuse, the gains may very well be larger than the losses. I tend to believe that they're mostly bigger than the losses, but I actually can't see how we expect people to see it. Well, I emphasize that logic to say that in some sense, this is like, when a surgeon says, no, I need to remove that. You don't ask the surgeon, okay, explain the entire pathology of that. You say, you're an expert, I trust you. So that's the key point, is that the reason why, where we're hurting is that we're not recognized as experts. We are not recognized as, because it's not because people will walk you through the logic of the Ricardian model that you will then say, okay, got it. That's an implausible thought. I mean, we could try, but mostly we're not going. That's not how, in a public debate, we're going to win. We're going to win because people will say, look, these guys, they know their shit, and that's where we are lacking. Here's another one. So this is one where, again, this is about immigration, and immigration is, again, another very common issue on which economists and others disagree. And economists were actually, I think, less optimistic than I was on this issue, but still they were more optimistic than the average person. An average quarter of the average people thought this influx would make Germany better off. I thought, personally, that number should be much higher, but whatever it was, again, the disagreement. Again, this is another issue where, it's easy to say, oh, I know somebody who lost his job because he was replaced by immigrants. The next thought is that, yes, but that person then got another job and the immigrants were buying something and you started selling to them. In other words, I think the point I'm making here is that it's not obvious that unless people trust us for other reasons, that they should listen to us. Because it's not what we say is often counterintuitive. It's not the obvious reaction, which is X lost his job. What do you have to show for that? This is another one. And this one I think was appropriate. I think people got angry about this. Is the yellow vests who are complaining about, the fact that, the carbon taxes were supposed to be so good for the world, but in fact they were sort of, we never knew what happened to them. And in particular, I think here is a key issue that we'll keep highlighting, so I want to highlight it here. The carbon taxes were clearly a distributive issue. The people who paid the carbon taxes in France were people who lived further away from the cities, who had to drive. The people who liked the carbon taxes in France were the people who had access to excellent public transportation and who didn't care. And as a result, it was perfectly reasonable for these people to worry about it. Now, what would have been the right response? Why does an economist believe that carbon tax is good? It's not because it's automatically good. It's because we take actions to make it good. The presumption is that we redistribute. We take those carbon taxes and we give it back to the people who paid it, and then indeed you would get the benefits. The problem is precisely that instead of doing that, what the government, the Macron government did at that point in France was to cut wealth taxes. That's going the wrong way. So in other words, part of it is we also send the wrong signals, that we, in supporting policies, we often manage to... now, this last graphic is one that just reinforces this point. This one is, you take the people who were asking the questions I mentioned in the previous set of graphics, and then told what the views of the economists were on that issue. When you look at that, the key point is nothing much changes. A small shift in the direction that economists favor. So economists say that it's hard to predict stock prices, and the views move slightly in that direction. But in general, the first order fact is that telling people what economists think doesn't change that. Again, in other words, our role as experts is being undermined. We're not experts. We are another view. Now that's a problem, and partly, of course, that's a problem that I think maybe this particular example is maybe almost gratuitously nasty to us as a profession. This is a paper from the IMF about, for example, the IMF's predictions of recessions, and the IMF routinely predicts recessions in the world, usually gets it wrong. In other words, if you look at the actual prediction, typically when you have to be well into a recession before the IMF notices that a recession is happening. Till then, it claims that the growth will be 2%, 3%. Then sometimes when we're into the middle of the recession, it says, oh my God, a recession is happening. So those kinds of things don't help, obviously. This is a quote from one of my old professors. I'll leave you to make what you want of that. Now, this continues the story. Basically, the IMF's predictions are roughly as good as random chance, or picking 3% every year. The prediction of growth is pretty much as well as that. So it's not. So this is something that doesn't make us look good. We look like, but I think, in a sense, I don't know that this is something that I actually don't blame people. I think it's very hard to predict and to do a good job. So I think we should just, sometimes we just say too much, and that's a potential problem. We say too much, but part of it also is that we say too much, partly because if we feel a professional obligation to answer questions. And one of the points we make in the book is that we would be better off as a profession if we shut up sometimes. I think we say too much and answer too many questions where we actually don't know the answer. So that's a sort of a part of the problem. But I think the part of the problem is that there's, I think rightly, a strong association of economics with ideology. Now, this particular view, this can't possibly be an objective view. It's a social responsibility. I mean, my view of what social is could be different from his, but I think pronouncing it as a way economics should behave undermines us. I think in some ways, I think we often state ideology as truth, and I think that hasn't helped us. So I think in general there is a perception that economists are somehow, a spokesperson for business interests, and that perception doesn't help us when we are trying to make a case for, something that's going to potentially create some displacement. Some people will get hurt. If you're not trusted, people will not surprisingly think that maybe what we are saying is not exactly right. And then in top of that, when we say things and it turns out to be false all the time, then that doesn't help any further. So, we first they don't trust us and they see that we get it wrong. They might say that we might be getting it wrong on purpose. So I think that puts us in a very uncomfortable place from the point of view of, I think, our own practice and for the role we can play in the world. That was the reason why we eventually wrote this book. In a sense, we wanted to be useful in the world and try to address some of these questions and try to say what I think actually, interestingly enough, most economists believe. I don't think what we wrote in the book was controversial. Actually, it was most professional economists of the kind we are tended to agree on what we said. Not entirely, but not. It was. I think we want to pretend we were radical, but we were not. We were mostly saying things that people accepted. People actually don't believe that every market works perfectly. People know that there are many kinds of frictions. People know that things don't always pan out. Trade is not always good for everybody. So I think, but I think saying it in a way that was coherent and maybe specific was helpful. So I mean, this was the motivation of the book, and in some sense it remains our motivation to be economists. I think we have to somehow address these issues, say something useful, say something that is maybe mundane, but in some ways I think is exactly the mundaneness of it which makes it hard to present, because I think as most economists open, if you ask me any question, I usually start by saying it's complicated. That's not helpful, but that's my instinct. And it is complicated usually. Unfortunately, that's how the world is. So the purpose of the book was to try to reduce that complication a little bit. I don't know how much we succeeded. And in particular, this is the metaphor that we like to describe ourselves. We are plumbers rather than physicists. We want to answer questions at the level they're asked, meaning not does our market economics good or bad? Those kinds of questions, mostly we feel like, they're not even well defined, and certainly as defined, they tend to not have useful answers. We want to answer questions which, as Ernst illustrated for us already, which have we can handle. Questions that have a sort of an answer that is within our compass. So I think I'm going to hand this to Esther with that background.
So what we thought we'll do for the rest of this is, instead of kind of walking you through chapter by chapter to what we are trying to do thematically in the book, we are trying to illustrate a few transversal lessons that come out, whatever almost the topics you look at, they always come back and scream at you. These are lessons that we wrote this book in 2018, and we thought the world was pretty hard, and I kept the ones that are still valid for our harder times. The first one that came across for economists, where we have a massive problem of legitimacy, but we don't have the worst problem of legitimacy. Politicians have the worst problem of legitimacy, and this problem of legitimacy is not just the politicians that fight for election, but also the ones who happen to run countries. And there has been in the OECD since the beginning of the 2000s at least, and continuing into the pandemic, a massive decline in trust in government worldwide. So this is the OECD number, but actually even in poor countries that are not part of the OECD, the same kind of trends are also observed. So the citizens trust their government less and less to deliver to them what they are pretending to deliver, or even less what they might want them to deliver. And that's not particularly surprising, because when you compare what the government tries to do to what private sector tries to do, generally, without controlling for the issues, government services do worse than private companies. That's not always true. Some government services are excellent, some private companies are pretty bad. But in general, it is true that you can expect a little bit more efficiency from your from a private company, from any random private company, than from the government. And so it becomes pretty easy to treat government as a punching bag. It becomes pretty extreme from time to time. For example, during the Tea Party movement in the US, where there was protest against Obamacare, there was this kind of slogans of keep government off my Medicare. Medicare being the government healthcare program was a little bit strange. I should say this is something that as economists we are also guilty of. We tend to really like to complain about government, perhaps development economists more than others. But the notions of corruption, inefficiencies, etc. This is something that keeps coming back in our day job as development economists. We rarely give a talk or an interview without someone asking, but all of that, at the end of the day, this is all about corruption, the buckets are leaky, and so on and so forth. So this is certainly in the works. And it's not saying that it's not an issue, but in fact, it is an issue. It is something that one needs to fight always. But these comparisons are not apples to apples, because it turns out governments, in most of our capitalist countries or social democracies of various kinds, governments tend to intervene only when we are trying to solve a problem that the private sector is not well suited to solve. Most of these problems are allocation problems where you're trying to do something that people would rather not do. So, for example, you need a government to put red lights, it's municipal government to put red lights so people stop at the red light, which is something they would rather not do. You need a government to tell people that they better lock down their business to protect the rest of society against COVID, which they would rather not do. You need a government to decide how kids will be allocated to scarce seats in universities, or patients would be allocated to scarce beds in a hospital. This last example is not random, because it turns out that in the US, for example, there are many private universities who are trying to solve a similar problems of allocating scarce seats in universities in a way that is not entirely following market prices. So if you could just follow market prices, you'd be good. The issue is that governments often are involved when you want to have more than one objective. So for example, you would like the more talented students to get in universities, even if they cannot pay, or you would want the poorer students to get in regardless of their talent, or both, or whatever. Now, when the private sector tries to do that, which they try to do in the US on a systematic way, private universities are trying to allocate their seats, combining these objectives, it becomes hard. And we've seen that in the huge university admission scandals, where basically you try to push prices and they come back by the back door via terrible corruption scandals in the private sectors. So my point is that the corruption scandals that exist in governments are often a reflection of the hard jobs government tries to do, as opposed to the fact that they are worse than anybody else is doing it. And when the private sector is confronted with the same issues, trying to solve problems, they have the same debate. Now, so this is just, as a sort of note to self, don't always complain about government. The COVID-19 crisis helpfully reminded us why we need governments. We need governments because nobody wants to shut down their business or really wear a mask unless they have to. We need government because only government can finance the fundamental research that led us to vaccine development so quickly, even if the later stage were done by the private sector. We need government because they are the ones who allocate the vaccines, at least at the beginning. And we need government because they are the ones who borrowed on behalf of us to have the economic rescue package. So you would think, and in fact, when we were giving talks at the very beginning of the pandemic, I had that hope, because I tend to be more of a half-full person, that this would be a moment where government legitimacy would come back. Because by and large, government, showed up for their citizens. The rescue package in the US and in Europe were phenomenal. The vaccines were developed very quickly. Fewer people died than should have, probably more than should have, but fewer than could have if nothing was done. And something that was very evident at the very beginning of the pandemic is the more governments were trusted, the fewer people died. And this is almost unrelated to the government, to the country's political system, to the country's wealth, etc. Trust in government was a massive factor in COVID success. But then, willy-nilly, as the government came together, you could have thought that this would have led to maybe a regain in the trust. Unfortunately, I think it didn't happen. There was kind of a teetering over the brink because people were, again, more resentful of the constraint government imposed than grateful of the success that having strong government led. This is from Canada, and this is a very recent photo showing the truck driver protest in Canada, of all places, one place where they are generally not anti-government. So despite that kind of coming together for a while, I don't think we have made much. It hasn't provided the kind of it hasn't provided in a sustained way the uptick in government confidence that one could have hoped, and that was evident, for example, in the Italian municipal election that were shortly in the beginning of the pandemic, where suddenly you had like traditional government party being elected instead of the anti-government set of elections they had before. But this difficulty in the trust in government is something that whatever you try to do across sectors, you hit to that. I don't have a solution for how you fix it, but it's a team that runs across the difficulty in acting, and something that collectively one needs to. Almost nothing else of significance, I'm thinking, for example, about climate change, will be feasible unless we solve that issue. Another lesson that runs across the book is that financial incentives are overrated. I added on the slides more than ever because I think the COVID crisis threw everything even more up topsy-turvy on financial incentives. So us economists, and that would include us, we love incentives. But people in general really like to think of other people, at least, to be very, very sensitive to incentive. So for example, one reason why we are terrified, or why the public is terrified of migration waves if the borders were open, is the idea that the wages are so much higher in Europe or in the US than they are in the South, that if only everybody could come, everybody would come, because we have it so much better. But another place where you keep seeing the discussion on financial incentive is on the limits of social protection. And it comes in two places. One is you cannot really easily finance social protection because you would have to tax people, and if you tax people, they would be less, they would work less, and therefore there would be less money. And on that, there is actually a pretty big literature, including a very nice paper from Switzerland. Some of you might remember that at some point Switzerland changed the tax system, the old tax system, to a traditional modern pay-as-you-go system. And as each canton, one and one, had to do that, they had to give people 2 years of tax holidays. So, because otherwise it was not organizable. So for 2 years, people had to pay no taxes in some cantons, and it was known in advance. It was known when it's going to end. So for an economist, it's really the moment where you want to work really, really hard, and then you can go on vacation for the next 2 years or whatever you feel. And Emmanuel Saez and co-authors have looked at that, and there is no impact at all on people's labor supply of these 2-year tax holidays. That's on the tax side. And then on the spending side, the worry about incentives is that if you are too generous, you get an income effect where people feel comfortable and they feel that they don't need to work so hard. And even worse, if these benefits that you're giving are taxed away as people become richer, then there is on top of that a disincentive effect coming from the substitution effect that you get less in your pocket for every dollar that you make. Now, there again, evidence starts to accumulate on both from richer countries and poorer countries about both income effect and substitution effect for people at the bottom of the distribution. And what is really striking is that it is so low. So for example, this is income effect numbers showing the impact of, it's a randomized control trial, one of these RCTs. In fact, it's a series of them that Abhijit and his co-authors put together, comparing people beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries from conditional cash transfer programs around the world. Conditional cash transfer programs are conditional on doing things like sending your kids to school and getting them vaccinated, but not working. So people who are quite poor and getting this relatively general conditional cash transfer program, you might have worried whether they stop working. And in fact, you don't see any of that, neither in their propensity to be in the labor force, nor in the number of hours that they have worked. In the US, we had pretty recent evidence of that, coming from the CARES program that was put in place by the Trump administration during the COVID-19 crisis, which gave people access to extraordinarily generous unemployment insurance. So people got unemployment benefit that were much higher, often in poor places, in the ratio of up to 2 or 3 times what they would have made if they were working. And that worried people no end, thinking people are going to stop working. Of course, many people did stop working because their jobs were not available. But the point you're seeing from this graph is that comparing places that had more generous replacement rates, which is this 5 or greater, to places that are less generous replacement rates, on average, the people who had more generous replacement rate work less because they were in poorer places. But it's not that they started working less after the program was put in place. In fact, if anything, they converged after the program was put in place. That's just one of 6 studies with different methodology that came out in studying this program, and all of them came up with the same surprising conclusion of 0 labor supply response to this extraordinarily generous unemployment insurance program. Nonetheless, this is something that's pretty hard to move. So this was, at the beginning of the pandemic, Chuck Grassley was worried about this replacement rate issue, saying people will stop working. After this study came about, the Wall Street Journal put out an op-ed saying, economists versus common sense. The economists are the Yale economists who showed these results, and the title of the byline was, if you pay people not to work, fewer will work, except at Yale it seems. So this is very much the idea that, you have, if your facts don't agree with my theory, then your facts must be wrong. But it turns out that in this case, the facts are pretty surprising, and the profession started thinking about why it might be the case, and I'm not going to get into various explanations. It's not that people are crazy, but the point is the facts were what they were, and this was pretty hard to move. So the fact that it's hard to move ideology on that is really influential in policy circles. For example, there is really always a coming back to, we cannot be too flexible on, for example, social protection for people who are suffering hardships, or assistance for the youth, because you don't want them to become lazy. And in fact, people like to make a virtue of showing that we are promoting a labor culture and so on. The third lesson is that really comes across all of the topic we looked at, is that the economy is incredibly sticky. What do I mean by sticky? It means people and factors, other factors, capital and so on, money, do not move very much from one place to the other or from one sector to the other. And the reason why, for example, economists tend to be very much in favor of trade is not because they think some people will not lose their jobs, but they think these people who lose their job making furniture in North Carolina will be able to move to New York to become furniture, a watchman in a furniture store. And that's kind of our model, take that into account. And so the overall effect on low-income people in the US, for example, would be negative, but not enormous, and we can then compensate people on average. But the thing we are seeing is not that. Because people, they don't move. Even in the US, where probably in Europe, you think of, you still have Tocqueville in mind, and you're thinking about these restless Americans going from place to place. The mobility rates are pretty low, and in fact, they are lower and lower. They have been halved since that speech. They have been halved with a lot of the decline happening precisely at the time where there was a huge shock with the open accession of China to the world economy, and therefore the competition experienced by the US. So we see, for example, that only 3.9% of people will move from one county to the other in a given year. Now, if people don't move, then that really changes a lot of things. For example, in reaction to trade, as David Otto and David Dunn have shown. People, if you lose your job making furniture in North Carolina and you do not go, it means you will be, you personally, not the low-income worker in general, will become quite poor. Then you will stop consuming. Then the people who are producing stuff for you in the area will also become quite poor, creating a snowballing effect in the region that would be totally absent, of course, if people were able to move across sector and region. So the fact that the economy is sticky is leading, A, to misallocation of factors, but B, a very strong reaction to things like trade, automation, and so on. Now, The same thing is true in poor countries, that people do not move. So you might imagine, because we often, in particular in the West, have this idea of of the cities being completely overrun by people from the city. But the first order fact in developing countries is people also don't go. And in particular, they are pretty reluctant to leave the countryside, which are nice, to the city, which are unpleasant. The COVID response has been a disaster for those who agreed to move. This is a picture from India, where millions of people found themselves in the street when the first lockdown was decreed because they had no housing, their housing was tied to their job, no money, and any social assistance they could claim was back to their own village. The result of that is that when the pandemic lifted, they were pretty reluctant to come back. And so what was a sticky economy, I think, has become potentially even stickier. I'll put a footnote to that, which is, in the US, it provided this one-time, everybody who was sticking to their job lost it anyways. And one time everybody moves around, which I think is quite excellent for the US labor market, actually, and is probably felt in this. In fact, salaries are going up, people are able to argue for better conditions and so on. So that's an interesting set for the US. The first lesson is from Ernst, and it's that the gustibus est disputandum, we can discuss taste. Let me relate that to, so most of us tend to consider preferences, including preferences on things that are complicated topics like racism, as something that people have, and we kind of have to deal with. In the US, it's a pretty difficult, it's an extraordinarily touchy, difficult topic, particularly because the pandemic really put racial inequality into focus. Early in the pandemic, the mortality rate among black, age-adjusted, was 4 times as high as for whites. Interestingly, it's moved to being twice as high in later stage because blacks were much more likely to be vaccinated than white towards the end of the vaccination campaign. But early on, blacks who were not more likely to be infected were much more likely to die. And then, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement happened, and the January 6th insurrection happened, where the racist element was pretty obvious. And you could think, and there was in my less optimistic moment, certainly I did think that, wow, this is a country where this racial element is so prevalent and hard to shake. But we did a study that showed that actually, maybe it's not true, and people can listen to things. People are not so hardened in their position. So in May 2020, we started working with doctors at the Center for Diversity and Inclusion at MGH to record and diffuse an informational message on COVID. And our original idea was to reach out to the Black community that was not otherwise very well represented in public messaging, since all of the faces that spoke to them were white. So we had a Black doctor, a Hispanic doctor, white doctor record these very simple messages, and then we ran online experiments. Our first experiment had only Black and Hispanics. Our second experiment, including white, again, a preponderance of non-white doctors. And what is striking is, number one, the intervention affects people's knowledge, affects people's willingness to pay for a mask. You watch these little videos by doctors, and then explaining to you about COVID, and then we ask, we offer you to sell you a mask, for example. We also check what people do later in terms of wearing masks and stuff. And we can see that all of these groups get affected. They are more likely, for example, they are likely to pay more for masks. But what I want you to take from this graph is that white Republicans who are much less likely to wear a mask, who want to pay less for a mask, and who were less likely to do anything to protect themselves during the pandemic in our data set, are just as likely to be affected as white Democrats by these messages, including when it's given by a young female doctors. So the point is not that people will not listen, is that if they have very different opinions, that they probably are reached by very different messages. And the point is that there is probably a way to function together. And our preferences, again, they are just the product of what we hear from our friend, what our friends do, what we have done in the past, and they are extremely malleable. And what people might think of themselves as being very strong view against wearing a mask can in fact be changed if someone tells them for 30 seconds that it's a good idea. But maybe they don't get to hear that too often. So that's this idea of the preferences being so much more malleable and therefore an object of intervention, including things as deep for the US as racial preferences and political views. The last one, and it's an exception to this idea that preferences don't matter, is one thing people, it's our kind of our way to wrap it up, is one thing people do want is dignity. And that is something that you find both in poor countries, where dignity is being able to feed people, and the poorest people who cannot feed people, who don't have enough food to put on the table, have rates of depression that are extraordinarily high. And in rich countries, where it's more about having a proper job, having a place in your society, in your friends, having social recognition status in a place. There was a protest against Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi, where during the COVID crisis, something about one of the COVID bill was too slow to pass, where someone had tagged on his door, Mitch McConnell kills the poor. And that's not true, but what is true is that in the US, being poor kills you. In that, or at least poor people have life expectancies that are quite different from rich people. So this is the expected age at death for people who have reached 40, for men and women, and you can see that the richer you are, the longer you will live. Now, there are many reasons for that. Including your pre-existing condition, your access to healthcare, etc. But one of the reasons, especially in recent years, as what Anne Case and Angus Deaton have called death of despair, which is the incredible rise of death by suicide, alcohol poisoning, and opioid overdose since the 2000s. You can see the darker it is, the more of the death of despair. Now, why is it related to dignity? Well, the argument they are making, and that I fully subscribe to, is the idea that part of this death of despair are caused by people precisely, for example, because of a loss of a job, because of inability to access the higher education sector, or so on, not finding a place, not finding a place where their dignity can be expressed. So this is, again, another focal point that makes policy making, that creates sort of a constraint to policy making, that anything where people feel their dignity affected, that's going to affect people's behavior, that's going to affect people's willingness to do things, that's going to affect people's willingness to trust them. And some of the reaction, for example, to Obama's war on coal was more a reaction of, you are attacking our dignities, this is war on us as people, as opposed to perhaps the rational conversation about what's going to happen to the coal jobs anyways. So in the current moment, there are opportunities and danger. One, and perhaps that moment has already gone, but during the COVID crisis, it was pretty clear to me that there was a really moment to redefine social protection, because both in the US and in France, in Europe, the whole of Europe, suddenly the government came together for people And everybody found themselves, almost everybody, so many people found themselves at the receiving end of extraordinarily generous, mostly quite smooth, social protection. And I still think, although time has passed already, that it was an incredible opportunity for people to demonstrate that social protection is not for the losers, it's for people who've hit a shock in life. And it turns out, in the COVID-19 crisis, we all hit it together, and some of the shocks are more idiosyncratic. And therefore, to delink this notion of if you need help, it's because you're lazy, or if you need help, or if I give you help, it's going to become lazy. I thought with everyone getting this experience in their own lives could kind of help start a national conversation about that, or a global conversation about that. The other one, and again, this is, it has a question mark to it, I guess all of them has a question mark to it, is we live in such a strange moment where things that we didn't think were going to happen, happened. The pandemic, it was something that had been predicted, that it was not a matter of if, it was a matter on when. But I don't think, at least I didn't, I think most people didn't really take that very seriously. And then it happened. As human beings, we are pretty set in our projection bias. So we think what's now is pretty much going to stay tomorrow. But this was so different. And therefore, this was a moment where, and I think we have that again with the war in Ukraine, because I don't think people saw it coming either, where, sometimes, bad things do happen. And therefore, maybe we need to listen to people who tell us that climate change is going to be a problem. The third one, and there, earlier I added the question mark, is this this notion of whether this moment creates a sense of a shared destiny at the global level. When you have something like the pandemic, you realize that the whole world is in it, and certainly the right words were said. There would have been a time where we could have helped these countries, the poor countries, financially, where we could have helped them getting rapid access to vaccines, which, number one, would have been good for us, and number two, would have demonstrated the possibility of working together towards a common goal. I think unfortunately, our dear leaders maybe missed that boat slightly, or completely, which was unfortunate both from the point of view, for example, of fighting the pandemic, but also because if you lose such an easy opportunity, what are we going to do about climate change that is going to be mostly a problem in the poor countries? So let me end there. I think it's the time to take it a bit more globally. So therefore, I say to you, let the world arise, and thank you very much. You come in.
Forward. Is this forward?
Oh, yes. Yep.
So thank you very much, Esther and Abhijit, for this engaging presentation. You see also, again, the menti.com access code. We have collected lots of questions here, and some of them became, people could also have kind of support the questions, so we have kind of the strength with which they want to know, at least quantitatively. And one question that was not surprising to me, because you're both also development economists, was that is traditional development aid, as still practiced by many humanitarian organizations, still viable today, or at all viable today? And well, maybe you make a comment on what could, you have to make an interpretation here at traditional development aid, but maybe you say something on on traditional development aid and what the benefits and costs are, or what could be done better there?
I mean, I think it's, I guess, it's a bit unfortunate that that the question is framed that way, in a sense, because I don't know that there is any reason to think that traditional development aid has run its rate. If you think about, I think the period from 2000 to 2020, in many ways, they were one of the great successes of development aid, where the HIV epidemic in Africa was contained largely on the strength of Gavi and the, various institutions that supported that to make possible people who to get access to treatment for HIV. So I do think that it was a very if you think about what happened to malaria deaths, this is a period where in 2000 people were predicting enormous numbers of deaths from HIV in Africa, and it never happened. Because, in a sense, the medicines were made available at a low price. The property rights were dealt with, and then the medicines were produced and delivered. And you can think of, one of the great, since 2010 to 2020, in that period, death from malaria among children in Africa gets halved. That's a fact that's stunning. That's a lot of kids who are living as a result of that. A lot of that came out of, funding of various kinds of initiatives, including giving away of insecticide-treated bed nets. If you think about more generally child and maternal survival, the vaccination rates have gone up, and as a result, there's been since 2000, the years 2000, there's been a massive drop in child mortality. And this is not happening in China, it's happening in sub-Saharan Africa. So in some ways, I think the project of, this was a good period in terms of successes of global aid. Very traditional kind. Which is, sometimes they were organized by UNICEF, sometimes they were organized by private sector, but this is very traditional aid, and it contributed, I would say, as dramatically to the improvement of human welfare as most things can. So I have no reason to think that, in a sense, I think what's disappointing about the COVID episode is that this was not repeated, that there was, and indeed, this moment, we have a huge chance, because I think, I heard this number from, maybe it's not, I don't know how they came about it. I'm a board member of Save the Children, which is an international NGO, and they were claiming 500,000 children will die of starvation if the hunger in sub-Saharan Africa is not assuaged this year. And that's a number that, it's extraordinarily cheap thing to do. If we want to do something, we can do it. It's not, I think that's traditional development aid, just, get them the money so they can compete at these higher prices and, distribute the grains. And I think it's all doable. If these kids die, it's not because there's no economic mechanism to make it happen. So I want to say, this is a moment where development aid is extraordinarily relevant. We should, I think, thinking about, in a broader context, maybe there are other things we should also think about, but this moment is very much one where this is something we should be passionate about and try to make it work.
Okay, thanks a lot. There is another question here. Do you think there is a trade-off between reducing inequality and climate and fighting climate change?
No, I don't think there is a trade-off. I think there is a complementarity. I don't think it's possible to get political agreement for fighting climate change without working for a distribution at the same time. That's for the reason that Abhijit illustrated with the yellow vest T-shirt, which is, if people, what was written on the shirt is the money to fight climate change is in the fiscal paradise, not in the pocket of the proletariat. And if people feel it's coming from them, then they are just going to vote it down. So unless, I think the agendas need to work together, otherwise the end of the month issue will always dominate the end of the world issue in the richer countries.
There was another question here that if you were advising one of today's billionaire donors on how to most effectively invest their income, I mean not for profit.
I would advise that he talks to someone else.
what would you tell them?
Right now, I would say, deal with the hunger crisis. I absolutely think that this is the easiest thing we could do. If we really let 500,000 kids die, I don't think anybody should forgive us. I think this is unforgivable. So, I am all for. I think I have a straightforward answer. Do what you can to, get food to a large swathe of. Ethiopia, Somalia, northern Uganda, all kinds of places where starvation is looming.
And it's not even clear they need to get in the business of delivering the food. There's now plenty of evidence that if you give people cash, they will buy food with it, and they will do a very good job finding the food.
And if there is, whatever it is.
So it's not even, and now also in the COVID-19 crisis, countries in Africa have really shown that they can establish mobile transfer to program effectively and quickly, and they have, they can use satellite data and cell phone metadata to get a commendable job of identifying people who need the most, and so the money can go to people in this situation of emergency in a way that is just, tremendously efficient compared to what we were trying to do when it was all about, bags of grains.
So there's one other question here, and that kind of relates to these concerns about corruption in developing countries. So what are your thoughts on corruption in developing countries when it comes to implementing research findings? What would you advise, how would you advise to make this better? So let's say you send support down there, how do you prevent? You have done research on how to prevent corruption, so maybe you can say something on this.
I think Esther already, put some effort into that. I would say that when we do research, mostly we are very conscious of the fact that, nothing's implemented perfectly. And I don't think, I think that's partly corruption. Sometimes, in a sense, I'll give you an example. I think we get obsessed with corruption, and we did a research project where we were obsessed with corruption. In this research project, what we did was, the whole point was, in Indonesia, we needed to identify the poorest in the village so they could get a government program. The identification was to be done by the village community, and our primary concern was that we are going to have to prevent corruption. And so we did a very elaborate thing. We invited everybody in the village, and there was a huge pain. They all had to be made sure they came, and it took hours and hours and all that. As a control, we also did an experiment. There were a few hundred villages in each of these. So another few hundred villages, what we did was we actually let the elite decide. And the first order fact is that it made no difference, zero difference. We put a lot of effort into it. Now, what did we miss? We missed the fact that when you get, 50 families into the room and you try to get them to rank 50 families, it takes hours and hours. And we have randomized which households get ordered in the beginning and which get ordered at the end. And we find that the biggest loss is that people get really bored with this whole thing and say, damn it. It's and that was so much bigger than any loss that came from corruption. I think one can get obsessed with corruption. Implementation is a big issue. I want to make the point that implementation is a huge issue, but we should not think of implementation as being primarily or entirely preventing corruption. I think I wanted to add that to Esther's message, that you have to think about how things will be done, and we do think very hard about it, because if something cannot be implemented at scale, we don't usually do it. Unless it's basically what we call a lab experiment, we wouldn't do it, because I don't think there's any point in doing it. So if you want to do something over 400 villages, which is often what the scale we operate at, or more, sometimes thousands of villages, you know that there'll be corruption. You also know there'll be any number of other things that'll go wrong, and you want to be mindful of them. But I think thinking on putting the frame of corruption on it actually distracts in some ways. You want to think of it as being successful implementation.
Thanks. So there is, by the way, you can also raise your hand, and I try to catch it when you raise your hand, so people can also ask questions here. So you have the privilege of being here in this room. So you can ask questions here, but as long as you don't, I just take the questions from my iPad. So one question was, why should economists seriously engage with plumbing as you once proposed? Now, I don't understand the question fully, because is this a misunderstanding of the notion of plumbing, or is it in the way you use it, or is it a real understanding of plumbing as you use it, and questioning that notion? So maybe you can answer that.
Yeah. So let me take the question at face value. So first of all, never hire an economist to do your actual plumbing. Second of all, so the argument is not that it's all we should do. So the argument is not that every economist should do plumbing all of the time. The argument is that some economists should do plumbing some of the time. For two reasons. First of all is that when you spend a lot of time with policymakers, as we do, and policymaking, it turns out that policymakers have no patience for implementation details. They are often as much into the abstract thinking, great idea model as we are. And so they have this great idea, and then it's kind of the fact that that great idea needs to be implemented, they don't really have in mind. So this is, so unless we, so in a sense there is enormous gains. This is what Abhijit was talking about. Whether a policy will make a difference or not, well, if it's a stupid idea, it might not make a difference. But if it's a good idea, it might still not make a difference if it's not implemented properly. We had one example. For example, we worked with a company, a French private company, Veolia, in Morocco, on water connection. And everything was well thought out to pretty deep levels. The government had given the money. Veolia had a financial product, free credit that people could take to get a water connection. All the engineering was done. The actual plumbing was done, so that people just all the tubes were there, the pipes were there. But then people didn't take up the program. And it turns out, so we went from house to house, and it turns out they didn't take up the program because the paperwork was very heavy. And it's a bit unfortunate. Like, this is really a plumbing issue that kind of undermined the entire thing, which nobody knew. They had contacted us to see, can we help them figure out what people really refuse to get this water connection. Is they don't refuse to get this water connection. They were delighted to get this water connection, but they couldn't manipulate the paperwork. And so that's one reason. It's just because it's useful. There's so much investment that is wasted because of these issues that, someone needs to do it. And we have, it's often about information. It's often about incentive. It's often about behavioral economics, things that we happen to have an expertise basis on. And we don't have expert in so many things. So why not use our basis of expertise to be helpful? That's one reason. From the point of view of the profession, Another reason is that you learn so much by doing these plumbing things, because you are going like with no protection, like you don't know what's wrong, and you try things out, and then they work or they don't work, and then whatever, hopefully, for the world, hopefully they work, but from the point of view of the profession, if you don't learn, you still learn something. So a lot of insight have come out of this process, which then sometimes percolate back into better theories. For example, all of the work that Parag, Patek, and all of this crew of people has done on people navigating the complicated allocation of children to schools has been helpful in creating better allocation system, but B, very helpful in understanding, how you think about matching problems when people will not be patient enough to rank all the options. How do you think about matching problems when people might change their mind, which become in turn interesting theoretical problems. So from both perspectives, it's useful.
Okay, thanks a lot. There's one question that got a lot of likes. In Switzerland, we see a rise of direct cash transfers paid by individuals who pay a share of their income. It's on this webpage, for example, socialincome.org. What is your opinion about this when individuals engage directly with anti-poverty tools? Is that a viable, do you think this has a long-term, a big, sizable impact, or is it just a drop?
To whom does it come? You give money to one, Mr. Jones, or you?
Well, I don't exactly know how these websites work, but you can basically give money to probably to poor people, to persons directly, and as you spend a share of your income. So directly targeted help for people who are in need.
I guess in general, I'm all for using all the margins. I think the tax systems tend to have problems. As the tax rate goes up, for a variety of reasons, they are less and less able to. So this is in a sense another margin, and so I'm happy to use that margin. The question is really of fairness, and whether or not this means people have a theory of. From our work, I would say one concern is that people have a very clear theory of who are the deserving poor, and that might be often based on, religion or other ideologies. That's the deep concern there. Is that it's you might exclude people because this is not the kind of poor person we are sympathetic to. He drinks, or he does this, or he do that. We find in Indonesia that when you look at who people designate to be poor, you can easily back out what their theory is. And his theory is a little bit like, okay, this guy, he's lazy. He should not be. So people have a theory, and they're implementing it when they do social transfers. And I think that's a concern, because society, we may not necessarily always think that those theories are appropriate. So I think the question is, if the government made a commitment which says everybody will get 500 euros or 500 Swiss francs, and if the ones that don't get it from private donors will compensate, then it seems like a good idea. I feel like one shouldn't take the preferences of the private donors too seriously in such things.
So a final question, because many people asked, should we put the price on nature, or had questions on carbon pricing, and since this is also a topic of your talk. So in your view, how important is carbon pricing or carbon tax as an effective policy tool to mitigate climate change?
I think one has to distinguish putting a price on nature and a carbon tax. So I think the social cost of carbon is an essential policy tool, simply because it finds its way in everything. It's used to determine regulation. It's used to determine in the US. When the Trump administration came up, the social cost of carbon went back to $2 a ton, which is not very much. So a lot of you could suddenly open and do many more things. So this is an extraordinarily instrumental number. And it is also the way it is done, the way it is calculated now in the US, which mostly is then imported in Europe, is a bit strange, because it takes only into account the cost to the US economy, and that to only the economic cost. Michael Greenstone's lab, and not just his lab, like his entire collaboration of people, is slowly trying to calculate what the social cost of carbon would be if you were a little bit more reasonable about it. And just adding lives and counting all of the lives in the world would move it from what it is now to about $275, which would change a lot of cost-benefit calculation of regulation. So I think I try to get my students at MIT really excited in social cost of carbon, which is a bit of a project, because it is such an important number, and it's a number we don't see. This is plumbing, in a way. It's very, very, very essential number. But once you have a social cost of carbon, that can be used to think about everything, and the policy tools, including carbon taxes, regulation, quotas, quantities, etc., are diverse. And there people have, it become instrumental, like what works, what is politically feasible, at what cost, and so on. And this would be a longer conversation.
So basically, the important thing is to identify the social cost of carbon, and then to act. And then to act on it, and then you can think about how you want to act on it. There is, I think Abhijit has spoke about the plus and minuses of the carbon tax, and maybe can want to say more about this or not. Okay, so with that, I leave it. There would be many more questions. We could go on for another hour, but I want to thank Abhijit and Esther for their stimulating talk. I want to thank the audience for their interesting questions. I want to thank you for being here and coming to us and listening to these interesting talks. By the way, I want to advertise another talk. I want to take this opportunity. On September 20, we have Sergei Gurev. He is not a Nobel Prize winner, but also a very good speaker. And he has to say a lot because Sergei, left Russia because, in contrast to many of us who didn't see the true character of the Putin regime, he saw the true character. And together with his wife, they fled to Paris, and he wrote a book on spin dictators. And it's not just about Putin, but it's a book about the erosion of democracy that we observe in Poland, in Hungary, and Venezuela, and so on. So it's a widespread phenomenon. So you have formal democracy still, you have elections, but the powerful have a grip on many other means of repression and shaping public opinion, and that is becoming increasingly important, and he's giving us good insights on that, and of course he has very good insights on what happened in Russia, and given the war that we face today, the talk will also be interesting from that perspective. So September 20, don't forget it. And as a last announcement, our events are kind of recorded, and they are available at the UBS Center's YouTube channel. It's worth taking a look. There's today's talk there, so if you didn't understand everything that Esther said, so look at it again.
I said everything clearly.
And so this is the advantage of YouTube. You can look at it again. And there are many other interesting videos there from really interesting seminars we had. And you're welcome to look at that and enjoy it. Thanks a lot for coming, and I wish you a nice evening.